I'm not somebody who used to tell stories like this, and I still don't throw the word miracle around. But I can tell you exactly who I was when it started, and it wasn't a man I liked much. My name is Wade Preston. I spent 17 years hanging off poles for the county utility co-op, chasing outages in sleet, heat, and wind that could bend steel. I trusted load charts, weather models, and what my hands could tighten with a wrench. Then I burned out so hard I froze on a crossarm 40 feet up, clipped in, staring at a porcelain insulator like I'd never seen one before. They brought me down, put me on unpaid leave, and told me to rest. Rest felt a lot like failure. At that point, I had one ex-wife who was polite in the way people get polite after they're done hoping. One 8-year-old daughter named Emmy who had learned to be careful with me, and one dead father whose mountain homestead sat empty because I couldn't stand the quiet out there without him. The practical plan was simple. Drive up, winterize the place, decide whether to sell before taxes came due. The less practical truth sat under that plan like wet rot under a floorboard. I had already missed too many school pickups, too many calls, too many little stories that mattered when they were told and never came back once they passed. By the first week of November, the rain had turned mean around Black Ridge, the kind that starts as mist and ends as needles. I picked Emmy up on a Friday with 2 duffels, a cooler, and my father's old blue thermos rattling in the passenger footwell. She climbed in with her seatbelt already in hand, like she didn't expect me to remember. Ranger was tucked under her arm, that worn teddy with one ear flattened and a stitched-up seam down the belly where her mum had mended him twice. She nodded hello, then looked out the window and named trees as we left town. That one's sugar maple, that one's fir, that one's dead but still standing. She talked to the trees easier than she talked to me. "Got your boots?" I asked after 10 minutes of wipers and silence. "In my bag." "Rain jacket?" She patted her lap. "Right here." I nodded like we were co-workers confirming gear before a job. That stung more than I let show. She caught me looking once and gave me a small, polite smile. It was not the smile she used to give me when she was 5, and trusted me to fix anything. We climbed out of the valley on the old logging road, mud sucking at the tires, fog hanging low between dark trunks. The higher we went, the more my father's routines came back to me in muscle memory. Where to downshift before the washout, where the culvert always clogged, where he used to tap the dash twice and say, "Almost home." I didn't tap the dash. I gripped the wheel and kept seeing the look on my supervisor's face when I came down from that pole, half ashamed for me, half relieved I hadn't fallen. Men like me were supposed to carry load, not lose it. The homestead looked smaller than I remembered and sadder in the drizzle. Cedar siding gone silver, porch steps leaning, metal roof freckled with rust. Emmy sat still while I killed the engine, like she was waiting for instructions before entering a museum. Bristle, my old red heeler mix, lifted his head from the back seat and gave one stiff wag. He moved slower these days, white around the muzzle, hips tight in the cold, but he still watched me like I was worth following. "Rule 1, I said, forcing a light tone. "We check for leaks before we unpack. Rule 2, we don't touch Grandpa's axe unless I'm right there." She nodded. "Rule 3? I hadn't expected that. "Rule 3 is hot cocoa before dark, no matter what." That earned me a real smile, quick but genuine. That's a good rule. Inside smelled like pine boards, old coffee grounds, and shut-up air. I opened windows, set the damper, checked the propane, bled the line on the sink, and made a list on the back of an electric bill I found by the bread box. Emmy followed me room to room at first, then settled at the table with Ranger and a box of coloured pencils she'd brought from home. She drew without asking for anything. Every so often she held up a page, a hawk, a creek, a stick house with smoke. In each drawing there were two people far apart and one dog in between. By late afternoon I had gutters cleared, kindling shaved, and exactly half the confidence I pretended to have about the old furnace. The weather radio on the counter crackled every 20 minutes with updates about a system pushing in early from the west. Freezing rain likely overnight at higher elevations. Roads slick by dawn. Black Ridge ice storm, they called it. Like giving it a proper name made it easier to respect. I respected it plenty. I also knew what being snowed in with my daughter would mean. Nowhere to hide behind errands. Nowhere to run from awkward silence. Nowhere to pretend I had urgent work. We ate canned stew and buttered toast while rain tapped the windows harder and steadier. Emmy lined up peas at the edge of her bowl before eating them. Same pattern every time, and I recognized the habit from my own childhood so clearly it almost knocked the wind out of me. My father had done the same thing with corn kernels, methodical and quiet. I used to tease him for it. Now I sat in his chair, watching my daughter repeat him, and wondering what she'd inherited from me, besides disappointment. "Mum says storms sound louder up here," Emmy said. "They do. Roof's lighter gauge metal." She stirred her stew. "Will the power go out?" "Could. I've got lanterns and batteries." She nodded, then looked at me directly, which she didn't do often that weekend. "You know, stuff like that." I laughed once, short and rough. "That's the job, kiddo." She rolled a pea between thumb and finger. "Do you still have your job?" There it was, plain as a nail on a tabletop. Kids ask clean questions because they haven't learned evasive language yet. I stared at my spoon, then set it down. "I'm on leave right now," I said. "Needed some time off." "Because you were too tired?" "Yeah," I said, and then I made myself add the part that mattered. Too tired in my head, not just my body. I didn't handle it right. She studied me in that serious way she had, like she was checking if I meant what I said. "Are you in trouble?" "A little," I answered, "mostly with myself." She accepted that, not because it solved anything, but because children live in the present unless adults teach them to worry ahead of schedule. After dinner, she washed her bowl without being asked and asked if we could read one chapter from the old field guide her grandpa kept by the couch. We read two. She yawned through both. At bedtime, she stood in the doorway of the small back room, Ranger tucked under her chin, and hesitated. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "If you sell this place, can we still come to the creek sometime?" The question landed heavier than any bill on my kitchen counter back home. I leaned against the frame so she couldn't see my hands shake. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'm figuring that out." She accepted that too, but her face changed, the way water changes when wind turns on it. "Okay." I tucked the quilt around her, switched on the little nightlight shaped like a pine cone, and paused with my hand on her door. "I'm glad you came with me," I said. She looked at Ranger, then back at me. "Me too." After she fell asleep, I stood on the porch under the weak yellow bulb and split damp rounds into reluctant kindling, while drizzle found the gap in my collar and ran cold down my spine. The maul rang dull against wet wood. Bristle lay by the steps and watched the tree line, ears half up. Somewhere downslope, the creek carried on like torn cloth. The ridge usually held 1,000 small sounds at dusk, jays arguing, squirrels cursing, branches ticking as things moved through them. But that night, the weather pressed everything flat. I stacked what I had, flexed my sore hands, and felt that familiar weight settle over me, the one that told me maybe I was built for useful work, but not for the parts of life where people needed tenderness more than competence. I remember leaning my forearms on the porch rail and looking into the dark where my father used to stand after supper, and I said out loud to no one in particular, "I don't know how to do this right anymore." The rain answered on tin. Bristle got up, stretched, and came to press his shoulder against my leg, steady and warm. I rested my hand on his back and stayed there until my fingers stopped shaking. That was where it began for me. Not with wonder, not with mystery, but with a tired man on unpaid leave, soaked through listening to weather warnings and trying to figure out whether he still had it in him to be somebody his daughter could trust. I stayed on the porch a while longer after that thought, long enough for the damp to soak through my flannel and settle in my shoulders like sandbags. The yellow bulb over the door hummed and drew a few stubborn moths that looked just as confused by the weather as I felt by my own life. I kept saying I was staying out there to make sure the tarp over the woodpile was tied down, to check the downspout by the east corner, to do all the practical things a man could list and complete. The underlying truth was simpler and harder. I was stalling because going back inside meant being alone with my thoughts in my father's house, and those thoughts had gotten loud since I stopped climbing poles. Bristle leaned against my leg, then padded to the top step and sat, square and steady, the way he used to sit by the truck door while I loaded gear at dawn. When I finally went in, I moved through the cabin with deliberate routine, the same sequence my dad ran before every winter storm. Lanterns on the counter with fresh batteries, matches in a dry tin by the stove, 2 stock pots filled with water in case the pipes froze, extra quilts carried from the hall closet to the couch. I checked each window latch and pressed my palm to the glass, feeling cold creep through old seals. The weather radio crackled again, repeating the advisory with that calm, bureaucratic voice that made rough nights sound like meeting notes. Freezing rain beginning overnight, temperatures dropping fast after midnight. Travel discouraged on Black Ridge Road until conditions improved. By the time the clock above the sink clicked past 10, the rain had turned from steady taps to a thin, rattling hiss, sleet beginning to mix in. Emmy slept in the back room with her door cracked an inch, and from the hallway I could hear her slow breathing between gusts at the eaves. I stood there watching that sliver of dark room like it held instructions. Ranger was tucked under her arm, one paw sticking out from the quilt. She'd kicked a sock to the floor and left a pencil on the nightstand, sharpened to a careful point. Small evidence of a child who trusted she'd wake in the same place she fell asleep. I envied that trust. In the kitchen, I poured coffee gone bitter on the warmer, took one swallow, and dumped it out. Then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I sat at the table without trying to distract myself and let the whole messy ledger run in my head. Missed recitals, late child support payments when overtime dried up, that frozen minute on the crossarm when my hands forgot what to do, the embarrassed handshake with my supervisor afterward, my ex-wife Karen speaking slowly on the phone like she was crossing ice. I knew how to fix deadlines in wind. I knew torque specs and fault isolation. I didn't know why my own chest tightened when my daughter asked plain questions over canned stew. I looked up at the old beams, smoke dark from decades of wood heat, and for one long stretch, I let the silence do what it wanted. I told myself this couldn't be my life now, sitting in a kitchen that smelled like wet wool and cedar, too worn out to answer an 8-year-old without rehearsing. I reminded myself men come back from worse. I clung to the idea that rest was temporary, leave was temporary, this drift inside me was temporary. Then another thought came in under all that noise, quiet and clean. Temporary still counts if your kid is living inside it. That landed in me harder than any warning from the co-op office. I put both hands flat on the table and breathed until my pulse quit sprinting. Sometime near 11, I heard Bristle's nails tick across the floor toward the front door. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He just stood there with his head tilted and ears forward, listening through the wood. I clipped on my jacket again and opened the door a crack. Cold, wet air slid in, carrying fir pitch, mud, and that metallic smell storms bring when temperature drops fast. I stepped onto the porch, and that was when I noticed the ridge had gone quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not ordinary night quiet, not rain-muted quiet, a deeper hush, as if every small creature had agreed to hold still at once. No jays griping from the spruce, no squirrel chatter, no wing rustle in the huckleberry thickets. Even the creek sounded farther away, muffled under weather and distance. Bristle walked down 2 steps and stopped at the edge of the porch light, body angled toward the tree line west of the shed. His tail hung low but moved in a slow, even wag. He gave one soft exhale through his nose and kept looking into the dark. I followed his line of sight and saw only trunks and rain threads silvered by the bulb. Something, maybe 30 yards out, shifted weight on wet ground. I heard it as a careful compression in leaf litter, heavier than deer, then nothing. No rush, no crack of snapped branches, just stillness returning like a blanket pulled smooth. Every practical explanation lined up in my head right away. Elk drifting through, a neighbor's cow loose from lower pasture, my hearing playing tricks after a hard day. Yet Bristle did not act like he did around coyotes or bears. He stayed relaxed, almost courteous, like he was waiting his turn at a gate. "You see somebody, old man," I whispered. His ears twitched, but he didn't break focus. I stood beside him long enough for sleet to bead on my sleeves, and the hush held. Whatever was out there did not come closer. It did not circle. It simply remained, and then, after a minute or two, the sensation of being observed eased without fully vanishing. I cannot prove that part. It was a feeling more than a fact, and I know how that sounds. Still, I had spent a career reading conditions from small signs. Wire sway, ice weight, wind shift, line hum. That night, my instincts said the woods were paying attention without any bite in it. I checked on Emmy one more time, banked the stove, and lay down on the couch in my clothes with a blanket over my boots because I expected to get up if the power dropped. Sleep came in short scraps. I woke to sleet hammering the roof, then to quiet, then to the furnace kicking on with a cough. At some point, the storm edge must have moved east for an hour, because when grey light finally started pressing at the window panes, the sound had softened back to rain. I rose before the alarm on my phone, stiff and cold, and lit the stove hotter before pulling on gloves to check outside. The porch boards were slick with a thin glaze and spotted with blown needles. Mist hung low over the yard, turning the woodpile and fence line into smudged shapes. I took 2 steps toward the stack and stopped. Fresh split kindling sat neatly arranged under the tarp lip, dry side in, bark side out, exactly how my father taught me to set it. I crouched and touched the cut faces. Clean, pale, recent. No weathering, no grime. I knew what I had split the night before, and this wasn't it. The rounds I'd worked were stringy fir that fought them all. These were straight-grained cedar and alder, trimmed into even lengths like someone had measured by hand. Right beside that stack, on the porch's left corner near the post, lay 3 flat stones crossed in a deliberate pattern, 1 on top and 2 beneath, at opposing angles. Tucked under them was a small spray of late wild asters, purple gone faded at the tips from cold, stems freshly broken and beaded with rain. For a long second I just stared at the arrangement, waiting for my brain to slot it into a known category. Kids prank, wind-blown debris, something Emmy did yesterday and I missed. None of those held up. The stones were from the creek bank 50 yards down slope, not from around the cabin. The flowers did not grow near the porch this late in the season, and Emmy was asleep under a quilt with one sock off, same as she'd been at midnight. I looked across the yard for tracks, but the rain had done what rain does, softening edges and filling impressions until everything was half written. Near the steps I found one depression in the mud deeper than a boot print, oval and broad, then another farther out, already slumping in. They might have been anything by then. That uncertainty bothered and steadied me at once. Evidence maybe, nothing court-ready. I stood there in the mist with wet gloves and a heartbeat that had picked up for no reason I wanted to admit. Then the absurdity of my own posture hit me. Grown man on unpaid leave, staring at flowers on a porch like he'd opened a fairy tale by mistake. I let out one short laugh that fogged in front of my face and said, to the empty yard, "Well, thank you, I guess." The words sounded ridiculous and sincere at the same time. Bristle came up beside me and sat, looking from the stones to the trees, tail thumping once against the wet boards. I gathered the asters carefully and set them in a jelly jar by the sink when I came inside. I left the crossed stones where they were, not because I believed anything in particular yet, but because moving them felt like interrupting a sentence before I understood it. Emmy was still asleep, hair across her cheek, Ranger tucked under her chin, and for the first time in months, I felt curiosity push back against dread. I put the kettle on, listened to the rain ease to a soft drip from the eaves, and watched morning open over Black Ridge, as if the place had decided to tell me one small truth at a time. I put 2 mugs on the table and warmed milk for Emmy's cocoa before she came out rubbing one eye with her fist, Ranger dragging by one arm behind her. She stopped when she saw the jelly jar on the counter. The asters looked almost electric in the grey kitchen, purple petals against rainlight and old pine boards. "Those from here?" she asked. "Porch," I said. "This morning." She studied me for a second, searching for the punchline I didn't have. "You picked flowers." "I know. Big day for personal growth." That got a sleepy little laugh. Bristle huffed from his bed by the stove, like he agreed I'd crossed into unfamiliar territory. I made oatmeal too thick, then thinned it with hot water and pretended that was intentional. Emmy lined raisins in a ring around her bowl and fed one to Bristle when she thought I wasn't looking. The rain had eased to a drifting mist, and for an hour the ridge looked almost gentle, the firs breathing white along their branches, the yard shining dark and clean. I kept glancing at the porch corner where the crossed stones still sat, wet and deliberate. "Can we walk to the creek before it gets bad?" Emmy asked. I checked the weather radio again. The advisory still stood, but the harder band of weather was expected later. "Short walk," I said. "Boots, jacket, back before lunch." She nodded, already halfway to the mudroom. Ranger went under her arm, flattened ear forward like always. I stood at the sink and watched her tug on one boot, then the other, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. It hit me that I'd spent so much time worrying about big failures, I'd skipped smaller chances to just be there while she did ordinary things. That morning felt like a narrow opening, and I didn't want to waste it measuring myself against the past. By mid-morning, we were on the trail behind the shed, the same deer-worn path my dad used to take down to the creek. The ground gave under each step with a soft sucking sound where leaves had turned to slick layers. Water dripped from cedar boughs in patient intervals. Bristle ranged ahead a few yards, pausing to sniff, then circling back to check us. Old habits unchanged, even if his hips were stiff. At first, it was just a walk. Emmy talked about school art day and how the boy at the next table always borrowed her green crayon and never returned it. She named trees again, less for me than for herself, like she was greeting neighbours. I answered when it fit and let quiet sit when it wanted. The mist shifted in and out, and the trail narrowed where huckleberry canes crowded both sides. Then I noticed the first odd thing. Sections of those canes had been pressed down into a clean opening no wider than a person, bent but not broken, as if something large had moved through with care instead of forcing its way. I slowed and touched one stem. It was fresh-flexed, still springy, droplets clinging to the outer bark. Deer trails didn't look like that. Neither did elk push-throughs. Those were ragged, snapped, chaotic. This looked intentional. "Dad," Emmy said, pointing with Ranger's paw. "Somebody made it easier." I almost told her it was probably weather, then stopped because the evidence sat right under my hand. "Looks that way." She walked through the opening, like she'd been invited. I followed, feeling that same mixed current from the porch, unease braided with curiosity, neither one winning. A little farther down, where the trail dipped toward a muddy side channel, two young saplings had been arced inward and hooked against a stump, forming a waist-high rail along the slickest section. Not pretty, not decorative. Functional. Exactly where a kid might slip. I stood there in drizzle and stared at it, long enough for Emmy to turn around and ask if my knee hurt. "No," I said. "Just thinking." About what, exactly, I couldn't have explained without sounding unsteady. I'd spent a career believing most things broke from force, weather, age, neglect. I trusted failure modes, but here was a pattern that looked like care, and care is harder to diagram. I told myself maybe another hiker had done it, maybe a hunter, maybe somebody from Lower Ridge cutting across to check traps. Every explanation stayed possible, but none of them settled clean. At the creek crossing, water moved faster than yesterday, tea-brown and cold over rounded stones. Emmy climbed onto a flat stump near the bank and set Ranger beside her to free both hands, while I stepped across first and turned to help her. Bristle splashed through on his own and shook in one dramatic full-body shudder that sprayed my jeans. "You got me," Emmy said, trusting my grip as she hopped the last gap. "I got you." We stayed a few minutes skipping pebbles. Mine sank with the dignity of old tools. Hers skipped twice and she whooped like she'd won a county fair ribbon. On the way back, she talked about building a storm fort in the living room if the power went out. And I said we could as long as she accepted that my blanket folding standards were poor. She said, very serious, "I've seen your blanket folding. We'll work on it." For about 40 seconds, I forgot the porch stones and the weather and all my own bad history, and I was just a dad getting teased by his kid on a wet trail. We made it back before noon, peeled off muddy layers, and ate grilled cheese cut into uneven triangles. The day darkened by degrees after lunch, cloud ceiling dropping until the far ridge vanished. I was feeding split pieces into the stove when Emmy came in from the back room, face suddenly stricken. "Dad, Ranger." I turned. "What about him?" She swallowed. "I left him on the stump by the creek." I looked toward the window where sleet had started ticking against the glass in scattered bursts. The practical part of me lined up priorities. Storm incoming, temperature falling, daylight shortening. The other part saw her hands empty and knew exactly what that bear meant in a strange house, while weather moved in. "We can go now and be quick," I said. "Jackets, hats, no argument." 3 days earlier, I might have told myself the lesson about responsibility mattered more. That afternoon, I grabbed my coat before she finished tying her boots. By early afternoon, the trail had changed character, wet turning slick as the first skim of ice formed on exposed roots. We moved slower, Emmy between me and Bristle. Halfway down, I heard it, a heavy step off to our left, cushioned but substantial, like weight settling on soaked duff. I stopped. Emmy stopped. Bristle lifted his head, ears forward. Silence. I took 2 more steps. A second measured footfall came from farther ahead this time, then quiet again. I told myself, this couldn't be real in the way my nerves insisted. I ran through options fast. Another person paralleling the trail, a black bear still active late season, fallen limbs shifting under ice. But each guess frayed on contact with what I could hear. The cadence wasn't random. It matched us, paused when we paused, resumed when we moved, always offset, never crowding. My pulse kicked hard and stayed high. I wanted to turn us around and pretend I'd heard nothing. I wanted to keep going because Ranger sat out there in weather, and my daughter's lower lip had already started to tremble. "Stay close to me," I said, keeping my voice level. "I am," Emmy whispered, and threaded her hand into my jacket pocket, like she used to when she was smaller. The opened bramble corridor appeared again, clearer now, extending farther than before. Branches were bent outward in a line that guided us around a patch where the trail had glazed over. At one turn above the creek, fresh evergreen boughs had been laid rough side down over mud, giving traction where there had been none earlier. Whoever did it had done it recently. Ice still gathered at the edges. We reached the stump. Empty. Emmy's face crumpled for half a second, then she crouched and pointed. There. Paw print. In the thin mud beside the stump sat a print too broad for dog, too long for raccoon, 5 blunt toe marks and a deep heel impression already softening under sleet. A second and third print angled away upslope, spaced wider than any human stride I could have made in those conditions. Bristle sniffed once, then looked uphill, calm as a church usher. "Dad," Emmy said very quietly, "do you hear that?" I did, not close. Across the small clearing beyond the creek where fog thinned between alder trunks. A careful progression through brush, weight placed and lifted with intention. We edged to where we could see through the grey. He was there, 8, maybe 9 feet by the way. His shoulder lined against a bent fir limb I knew sat high over my head. Dark fur matted by sleet, broad back, long arms hanging low. He moved across the far side of the clearing with a deliberateness that made my scalp prickle. Not from threat, from precision. He stepped around a cluster of pale mushrooms instead of crushing them. A doe emerged from the brush with 2 small fawns tight behind her. He stopped completely and angled his body away, giving them room to cross the open strip. The deer passed at a trot, not panicked, just alert. He waited until they vanished, then continued slow and even. Bristle surprised me most. He trotted forward 5 yards to the edge of the clearing and sat, tail brushing wet leaves. Posture relaxed. Not submissive, not alarmed. Familiar. I heard my own breath loud in my hood. Emmy stood against my side, her gloved hand gripping my sleeve so hard I could feel the pressure through canvas. "Is that—" she started. "Yeah," I said, because any other answer would have insulted both of us. He turned his head once in our direction. I saw an eye catch the flat afternoon light, amber brown and steady. No charge, no bluff, just attention. Then he shifted his weight and moved along the tree line, each step placed like he was trying not to startle the woods themselves. In less than 20 seconds, the trunks took him back. We stood in sleet and listened until even those heavy, careful footfalls faded into weather. Emmy was first to speak. "He looked for Ranger, didn't he?" I opened my mouth, shut it, then nodded. "Could be." "Dad." "Yeah?" He was big, but he looked careful. I crouched to her level, heart still hammering, and answered the only true thing I had in that moment. Careful counts. On the walk back, we found Ranger set on a flat rock halfway up the trail, dry beneath an overhang of cedar boughs that had been pulled down to shed the sleet. I picked him up with both hands like he was something breakable and gave him to Emmy. She hugged the bear to her chest, then reached for my hand without looking up, and we climbed toward the cabin while the first real edge of the ice storm began to hiss through the trees. We climbed the last rise with sleet ticking off our jacket hoods and Ranger tucked under Emmy's chin like a small brown shield. The trail had gone from mud to a slick glaze in shaded spots, and every few steps I felt her tug my hand for balance before she trusted her boots again. Bristle moved behind us now instead of ahead, close enough that his shoulder brushed my calf once in a while, herding us uphill with the stubborn patience he used on calves back when my dad still ran two head in the lower pasture. I kept listening for that measured weight in the trees, and heard it twice more, farther off each time, never closing distance, always matching our stop-and-go rhythm, as if whoever made it understood exactly how fast an 8-year-old could move on ice. At the bend where the old cedar snag split the path, I saw tracks in a strip of wet clay untouched by sleet for maybe 10 minutes. They crossed our route, then widened into a long arc on the downhill side, and rejoined ahead, a broad loop that gave us the clear middle of the trail. The prints were deep and clean-edged, toes splayed slightly for grip. No claw marks, no stumble marks. Deliberate placement, heel to forefoot. Like someone carrying something fragile through a crowded room. I crouched to look closer and heard Emmy stop beside me. "Is it his?" she whispered. I nodded. "Looks like it." He could have walked right behind us. Yeah, but he didn't. I sat back on my heels and met her eyes under the brim of her rain hood. No, he didn't. We started moving again, slower than before, both of us stealing glances into the firs where fog pressed between trunks. By the time the roofline of the cabin showed through branches, my disbelief had worn thin in all the places it used to hold. I could still assemble practical explanations, but they felt like scaffolding around a building already standing. I had seen the size of him against timber and the precision in how he moved through brush. I had watched deer pass in front of him without bolting blind. Now I was looking at a trail pattern that said the same thing in mud. He knew we were there, and he made room. Inside, the cabin smelled like wet wool, stove heat, and cocoa powder. Emmy peeled off her jacket, set Ranger by the fire guard to dry, and held both hands toward the stove until her fingers pinked up. I changed socks, fed split wood into the firebox, and checked the radio. The Black Ridge warning had been upgraded to a full storm alert, with freezing rain expected to harden overnight and winds building after dark. The voice on the radio stayed level and clipped while saying roads might close till morning. It sounded exactly like every dispatch message I'd ever answered. Plain words for non-trivial trouble. Emmy sat cross-legged on the rug, brushing sleet pellets off Ranger's fur with a seriousness that made my throat tighten. "Dad?" "Yeah, kiddo." "If I tell Mom what we saw, she'll think I'm making it up." "She might." Emmy looked down, thumb smoothing the stitched seam on the bear's belly. "I'm not making it up." "I know." She studied me for a beat, weighing whether that answer was real. "Do you think he was watching us before today?" I leaned against the counter and chose honesty over comfort. "I think there are signs he's been near. The stones, the flowers, that opened path, the rail by the slick part." I let out a breath. I spent a lot of time trying to explain those away. I can't do that as easy now. "Are you scared?" That question sat right on the crux of everything, not just about the woods, but about me. I watched Bristle circle twice on his bed and drop down with a grunt, calm as a summer porch dog. I was jumpy, I said. Still am a little. But scared isn't the right word. I looked out the window toward the tree line blurring under sleet. I think I'm being careful with something I don't understand yet. She nodded like that made sense, and maybe it did. Children accept nuanced truths faster than adults if you give them room. By late afternoon, the storm tightened. Light drained out of the sky early, turning the yard to blue-grey and the woods to layered silhouettes. I set lanterns out, topped off water buckets, and stretched a rope across the porch to keep the tarp from snapping loose. When I went to the shed for another armload, Bristle followed, then stopped halfway and looked toward the lower fence line. Not rigid, not alarmed, just attentive. I turned and saw movement between two fir trunks, a dark vertical mass, still as bark, bigger than any man I knew. He stood maybe 60 yards off, partly screened by branches heavy with ice. His head was angled slightly, watching me work. I froze with a split log in each hand. The old reflex rose first. Assess threat, measure distance, identify route. Then the scene itself contradicted it. He wasn't closing in. He wasn't posturing. He shifted once to avoid stepping on a fallen tangle of brush, then went still again. Bristle sat down right there in sleet and gave one low, contented exhale. I set the logs in the wheelbarrow and, without any plan worth naming, lifted my chin in a small nod toward the trees. The figure did not retreat. After a second, he lowered his gaze, turned with remarkable quiet for his size, and moved along the contour line until trunks swallowed him. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It felt shared. When I came in, Emmy was at the table drawing the clearing from memory. 3 deer, a wide dark shape near the edge. Me in a red jacket that made me look taller than I am. "You were out long," she said. "Had to secure the tarp." I set more wood by the stove. "He was there. Down by the fence." Her pencil paused. "Did he run?" "No." "Did you?" I laughed once, surprised at myself. "No, guess we both stayed put." That earned a quick smile before she went back to shading trees. Outside, sleet hardened against the windows in grainy bursts. At 6:30, the power blinked twice, held for 10 minutes, then dropped for good with a soft click from the fridge and a settling hush that made the storm sound closer. Lantern light turned the cabin walls amber. Shadows moved when we moved. Emmy and I built the storm fort she'd requested, and my blanket folding lived down to her review. "Dad, this corner's collapsing." "It's an architectural feature. Rustic design." "It's a blanket on a chair." "Same thing in mountain construction." She laughed into Ranger's ear, and for half an hour we sat under quilts with flashlights and read field guide pages about owl species while sleet rattled like dry beans on the roof. If life had stopped there, it would still have been one of the better evenings I'd had in years. Then wind found a seam in the old place and started pushing through with a low whistle. The stove needed feeding every 40 minutes to keep ahead of the cold, and each trip to the mudroom tracked in damp from the porch. Around 9, Emmy got quiet in the way she did when homesickness hit. She asked if she could call her mum when the signal came back. I said yes. She nodded, then carried Ranger into the back room when I told her it was bedtime. I checked the door latch, banked the fire, and sat on the couch listening to weatherwork over tin and timber. I must have drifted off for 20 minutes. A sharp gust hit the west wall and woke me. The lantern had burned lower. Bristle stood in the hall, ears up, looking toward Emmy's room. Then she called for me, voice thin and breaking. "Dad!" I was on my feet before the second word. She sat upright under the quilt, hair stuck to her cheek, eyes wet. Hey, I'm here!" "I can't find Ranger." Her breath hitched. "He was right here. I had him. I woke up and he's gone. I swept the bed, floor, nightstand, fort, couch, kitchen chairs, everywhere a bear could slide in a blackout. Nothing. She started crying harder, and then the second fear came out tangled with the first. I want Mum's house. I want my own room. I don't like this storm. I knelt by the bed, heart thudding with old panic, that familiar conviction I was about to fail at the exact thing that mattered most. "You're okay," I said, though my voice shook. "We'll find him. I need him. I know." Bristle moved to the bedroom window and gave one soft woof, not warning, more like an announcement. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans without thinking, and stepped to the glass. Moonlight was trying to push through racing cloud, enough to silver the sleet on the porch rail. In that shifting light, I saw him. He stood at the far edge of the porch, head bowed slightly against the weather, one massive hand cradling Ranger by the middle as gently as Emmy did. The bear's fur was mud damp along one leg, like he'd been lifted from near the steps or from brush just beyond them. The figure moved closer in 2 slow steps, each one placed with care on ice-slick boards. He set Ranger on the windowsill outside Emmy's room, adjusted him upright with fingertips broad as kindling blocks, then withdrew his hand and stepped back so I could see clearly. For a long second we looked at each other through glass furred at the edges with frost. His eyes were steady, amber brown, even in low light, watchful and utterly without malice. The scale of him should have overwhelmed everything else. Instead, what filled the frame was restraint. He had found the one object my daughter needed and brought it to the one place she would see first. Deliberate, unmistakable. A kindness aimed straight at the center of our night. I lifted the window latch and raised it 2 inches against sleet sting, just enough to reach. Cold air knifed in. Ranger's fur was wet and smelled like cedar and clean earth. I pulled him inside, shut the window, and turned back to Emmy. She grabbed the bear so fast she nearly knocked over the lantern, then clutched him to her chest and started crying in relief instead of panic. "Where was he?" she asked through tears. I looked towards the porch again. The figure was still there, farther back now, half shadow among blowing ice. Bristle stood at my knee, tail moving once, slow. "He came back to you," I said. She stared at me, then at the window, then buried her face in Ranger's flattened ear. I sat on the bed edge and she leaned into me hard, all 8-year-old weight and trust and fear and exhaustion. Words I'd dodged for years came out plain because there was no room left for evasions. "I'm here now," I told her, hand on her back, voice low and steadying as much for me as for her. "And I'm staying." Her grip tightened on my sleeve. "Promise?" "Promise." When her breathing finally slowed, I looked out once more. The porch was empty, but not untouched. Beyond the rail, near the woodpile, shapes loomed where no shapes had been before. Fresh rounds stacked in a second row, bigger than what I'd hauled at dusk, aligned tight against the tarp for morning use. The storm kept hissing through the trees, but inside the cabin, Emmy slept with Ranger under her chin. Bristle curled at the doorway, and for the first time in a long while the world felt larger than my failures, and kind enough to live in. I stayed on the edge of Emmy's bed until her grip loosened, and sleep took her again in small, shuddering breaths. Ranger was wedged under her chin, one flattened ear against her mouth, and every few seconds she made that tiny humming sound kids make when they are settling back into safety. Bristle lowered himself across the doorway like an old rug with a heartbeat, eyes half closed but still tracking me. The lantern flame trembled once when wind struck the wall, then steadied. Outside, sleet kept whispering over the roof in long, slanted sheets. I stepped into the hall and closed her door until it was barely cracked. enough that I could hear her if she called. Then I leaned both hands on the knotty pine paneling and felt my shoulders start to shake before I had any say in it. I had held myself together through outages, wrecks, layoffs, court dates, and bad phone calls, and I could usually lock things down until there was practical work to do. That night, something gave way. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a quiet break in the middle of that old house where my father used to keep his boots lined square to the wall. I cried there with my forehead against the paneling, not from fear of what I had seen, and not even from relief alone, but from the clean, humbling fact that a mercy had arrived at my daughter's window when I had no plan left. I remembered every careful answer I had given for years to avoid saying the truth. I'm busy. I'm tired. I'm trying. I'm doing my best. In that hallway, I heard how thin those had been when what she needed was presence. I told myself this couldn't be repaired in one night, and that part was true. I also knew repair had started anyway. Something in me that had been braced like frozen wire finally thawed enough to bend. By the time I could breathe without hitching, the lantern in the kitchen had burned down a finger's width, and the storm had shifted from hard pellets to wet, heavy sleet. I wiped my face on my sleeve, took the hallway slow so the floorboards wouldn't pop, and checked Emmy once more. She had rolled onto her side with Ranger pinned to her chest, and one small hand fisted in the quilt. Bristle looked up at me as if asking whether we were all right now. I nodded at him like he could understand words. Maybe he did. In the kitchen, I put a kettle near the stove, then stood at the window over the sink and watched the porch through warped old glass. The fresh wood by the tarp looked almost unreal in lantern spill, 2 neat rows where there had been one. Big rounds on the bottom, split pieces stacked tight above, bark turned outward exactly the way my father insisted, because it shed wet better overnight. Whoever had done that understood wood heat, weather, and urgency. I don't remember deciding to go out. 1 minute I was staring, and the next I had my jacket over long johns and boots half-laced. Lifting the door carefully so it wouldn't squeal, cold struck my face and slid down my collar. The porch boards were slick, the rail glazed, and the yard beyond was silver and black under racing moonlight. I stepped to the windowsill where Ranger had sat. In the thin crust of slush there were shallow watermarks where something broad had rested, then lifted away. No claw gouges in the painted trim. No damage, just a damp outline already blurring in sleet. Bristle came out beside me and stood close to my leg, warm through denim. He looked toward the west edge of the yard, ears forward. I followed his gaze and made out a shape near the firs beyond the lower fence, darker than the trunks, tall enough that the branch line cut across chest height. He was there, still, not hiding and not approaching, his head slightly turned toward the cabin as if listening through weather. The distance between us felt intentional, enough to reassure, enough to avoid pressing. I lifted one hand, palm open at shoulder height, the way line crews signal hold when words get lost in wind. It was the only gesture that came naturally. For 2 heartbeats he did not move. Then he dipped his head once, slow and measured. No flourish, no performance, just acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, and the wind took most of it. He shifted his weight and stepped out from the fir shadow long enough that moonlight traced his outline cleanly. Broad shoulders beaded with sleet, long forearms fur dark and rain-heavy, movements precise despite his scale. He turned toward the woodpile first, crossed in front of it, and paused with one hand near the top row, as if checking stability. Then he moved down the contour of the yard towards the old split-rail fence, placing each foot where ice looked thinner, avoiding the patch near the buried stump that always rolled an ankle if you hit it wrong. The resulting impression was not of retreat under pressure, but of a neighbor finishing a task and heading home before daylight. Halfway to the trees, he stopped and looked back once toward Emmy's window. The pinecone nightlight glowed faint amber through the curtain. He remained there for several seconds, listening. Inside, nothing changed. No cry, no scramble, no panic. Bristle's tail gave one soft thump against my calf. Only then did the big figure continue. The fur line took him in layers. First the legs vanished in brush and shadow, then the torso dissolved behind trunks, then the head and shoulders blurred into moving branches. I could still track him by the subtle sway of saplings and the hush of wet boughs brushing fur. A little farther upslope, those signs faded too. The woods closed around him without ceremony, and the night returned to weather, timber, and drip. I stayed on the porch longer than I needed, letting sleet bead on my eyebrows and melt down my cheeks. The ridge did not feel empty after he left. It felt inhabited in a way I had never allowed for, as if my map of the world had been missing a whole region, and someone had quietly drawn it in. I laughed once at myself, low and tired, because I had just given a hand signal to a 9-foot stranger in an ice storm while wearing one unlaced boot. If anybody from the co-op had seen me, I'd never hear the end of it. Then I thought about how little that embarrassment mattered beside Emmy sleeping without tears, and the laugh turned into another rough breath I had to steady. Inside, I stripped wet layers by the stove and fed in 2 splits from the new stack. They caught fast, dry and resin-rich, and the fire answered with that clean crackle good wood gives when it was cut and stored right. I filled a mug with hot water and a spoon of instant coffee, sat at the table, and watched the lantern throw slow shadows over the asters in their jelly jar. Their petals were beginning to curl at the edges, purple fading toward grey, but they still held shape. Crossed stones on the porch, flowers in rain. A path opened through bramble. Saplings bent into a handrail, a snare cut without wrecking it. Ranger returned to the sill. Wood doubled before a hard freeze. Piece by piece, the pattern held. I didn't sleep much after that. I dozed in the chair with my boots on and woke each time wind changed direction. Once around what I guessed was 2 in the morning, rain took over from sleet and drummed in a lower, heavier rhythm on the roof. Once around 4, the temperature dropped again, and the drumming sharpened back to ice. Between those shifts, I checked Emmy's room, adjusted the stove, and looked out at the yard where no movement showed beyond blown branches and water streaming off the eaves. Near dawn, the storm finally began to spend itself. Not all at once. First the gusts shortened, then the pelting on tins softened to a scattered tapping. Then came long pauses where I could hear the creek again, fuller now, running under ice crust and broken leaves. Grey light seeped into the kitchen and turned lantern glow unnecessary. I trimmed the wick anyway, out of habit, and set it aside. When I opened the front door at first light, the air smelled rinsed and sharp, fur and wet earth and cold stone. Clouds were breaking in torn bands over Black Ridge, and thin gold light reached through to touch the upper branches, while the lower woods stayed blue with shadow. Drip fell everywhere, patient and steady from needles, rails, roof edges, tarp corners. The yard looked battered but intact. The doubled woodpile stood tight and square. At the porch corner, the 3 crossed stones were still in place, dark with water, asters gone from beneath them now because I had brought them in. I stepped down carefully and walked to the edge of the yard where mud held impressions best. Rain had blurred most surfaces into slick brown sheen, but along the fence line I found 3 deep prints angled toward the firs, larger than any boot, heel and forefoot, clear enough to read direction. Another print sat near the buried stump, precisely where he had avoided the ice patch by shifting left. A final partial mark showed at the first line of brush. Then nothing. I crouched there with one hand on my knee and looked into the trees until my eyes watered from cold. Behind me, the cabin door creaked, and Emmy's sleepy voice carried across the yard. "Dad, you out there?" I stood and turned. She was on the porch in my old wool coat over her pajamas, Ranger clamped under one arm, hair wild from sleep. Bristle slipped past her and trotted down to me, then circled back as if corralling us together by instinct. "I'm here," I called. She came down one step, then another, careful on the wet boards. "Did the storm stop?" "Mostly," I said. "Think it finally ran out of steam." She looked toward the tree line, not scared, just thoughtful. "Do you think he's gone?" I glanced at the prints, then at the fir shadows where morning light was slowly settling. "For now," I said. "Looks like he made sure we were all right first." Emmy hugged Ranger tighter and nodded like that answer belonged to her too. We stood there in the cold, listening to water drip from the eaves and sunlight work its way down the ridge. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next failure. I felt present, which turned out to be the rarer skill. I took Emmy's hand and we went back inside before her bare ankles could get cold in the wet air. The stove had burned down to a red bed, so I fed it 2 of the dry splits from the second stack and listened to them catch quick and clean. Emmy sat at the table in my wool coat with Ranger in her lap while I made oatmeal again, thinner this time so she wouldn't have to pretend to like it. By the time steam fogged the kitchen window, 1 bar of signal blinked onto my phone. Emmy looked up at me over her spoon. "Can I call Mom now?" "Yeah," I said and handed her the phone. "Speaker so I can fill in road conditions." Karen answered on the second ring, tight-voiced from worry that had been building all night. "Emmy, honey?" "I'm okay," Emmy said quickly. "The storm was loud, but I'm okay. Ranger got lost and then he came back." Karen went quiet for a beat. "Came back how?" Emmy looked at me. I nodded for her to tell it straight. "The big careful one brought him to the window." Another pause, longer this time. Then Karen said, very measured, "Wade, talk to me." I took the phone. "Road's still slick at the switchback. Don't come up till noon. We're safe, stove is hot, water's fine, plenty of wood." I let one breath out. She's telling you what she believes she saw. I saw enough that I'm not correcting her. Karen didn't argue. She didn't agree either. "I'll be there when the county plough report's passable. Keep your phone on." Her tone softened at the edge. Thank you for keeping her calm. After we hung up, Emmy traced circles on Ranger's stitched seam and looked toward the porch where the crossed stones still sat dark with meltwater. "Can we say thank you for real?" "We can," I said. We cut an apple into wedges and she chose a bright green marble from her coat pocket, the one she'd carried since summer fairs. At the tree line where Bristle had stared the first night, we found a flat rock half hidden by needles. Emmy set the apple slices in a neat fan. She placed the marble in the center like a jewel. I set one of the porch stones beside it, not as a claim, just an acknowledgement, and we walked back without looking over our shoulders every 2 seconds. The woods were full of drip and jay calls again. Ordinary sound returned, and that normal noise felt like permission to breathe. By noon, the plough had scraped Black Ridge Road to a rough pass. Karen's SUV came up slow, tires crunching on refrozen slush, and stopped near the shed. She got out wrapped in a long coat, scanned Emmy from boots to face, then held her for a full minute with eyes closed. I loaded their bags while they talked by the porch steps. When Emmy ran inside to grab her drawing folder, Karen stayed where she was and fixed me with the same practical look she used in court hallways years earlier. "Did somebody come onto the property?" she asked. "A person." I could have ducked it. Instead, I said, "Something came onto the property. It returned what she needed, and kept distance the whole time. Karen searched my face for signs I was slipping. "You sound very certain for a man saying something that strange." "I'm certain about behavior," I said. "Careful, deliberate, no threat." She nodded once, not convinced, but listening. "Report anything that could involve Emmy's safety." "I will." When Emmy came out, Ranger clamped under one arm and her clearing drawing under the other, Karen glanced at the paper. The dark figure stood near 3 deer and a man in a red jacket. Karen started to say something, stopped mid-thought, and just folded the drawing carefully before tucking it into her tote. She never finished that sentence, not then, not later. What she did instead was call me that evening after they got home and say, "She slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Keep next weekend open." The next morning, with roads wet but open, I made the 2 required calls from the porch, while Bristle dozed in a patch of sun. First, I called the county wildlife office and reported the cut rabbit snare near my boundary, the unusual tracks and evidence of a large animal moving repeatedly through the corridor by the creek. The officer on duty, a man named Herrick, sounded polite and tired. He took coordinates, asked for photos, and told me not to approach any unidentified wildlife. I emailed 4 pictures, prints with my boot for scale, the opened bramble passage, the sapling handrail, and the cut snare wire coiled on my workbench in a freezer bag. 3 days passed before Herrick called back. "We found an illegal trapline on lower parcels and removed it," he said. "Can't verify your track ID from rain-softened images. But your report was useful." That was enough for me. The snare thread had an ending that mattered. My second call was to the realtor handling my father's place. "Don't list it," I told him before he could run numbers. He laughed like I was negotiating. I wasn't. "I'm keeping the homestead," I said. "Take it off your books." He read back my decision, and I heard my own voice steady when I confirmed it. That one sentence changed more than the deed's status. It gave Emmy a place that wasn't conditional on my moods or my overtime. By the second week of December, I was driving up every Friday I had custody, sometimes alone on alternating Saturdays just to keep pipes, roof, and wood in shape. Emmy and I settled into a rhythm that felt ordinary in the best way. Groceries from Miller's, boots by the stove, cocoa before dark, one-trail walk if weather held. At the flat rock marker we left small things, and never anything wrapped in plastic. Apple halves, wildflower stems in season, and marbles Emmy chose with ceremony. We never left food when bears were active low on the ridge. In deep cold we left only bright stones and braided grass. Twice we found broad prints set back from the marker in a fresh snow, one left, one right, like someone had approached, stopped, and stepped away. No spectacle followed, no demand for belief, just continuity. Work came back slower. In January, I met my supervisor at the co-op yard, hard hat under my arm, hands sweating inside gloves despite the cold. He looked older than when I came down from that cross-arm. "You ready to climb again?" he asked. "Not full storm rotation yet," I said. "But I'm ready to work, and I'm doing the counselling they required." He gave me a long look that could have gone either way, then nodded. "Ground crew first. We build from there." That was the whole speech. It was enough. I took the slot, kept my appointments, and stopped pretending endurance was the same thing as health. In February, Karen and I met at a diner halfway between town and the ridge while Emmy was at school. No lawyers, no paperwork stack, just 2 mugs of bad coffee and a yellow legal pad with custody days. She watched me scratch out dates, then said, "You don't disappear mid-conversation now. That's new." I know. She still talks about the careful one. I know that too. Karen stirred her coffee and looked out at parked trucks glazed with old salt. "I don't know what happened up there," she said. "I know she came back less anxious. And you came back Present. She tapped the pad. Let's keep building from that. We did, not perfectly, reliably. When March softened the ground, I carried the jelly jar from the kitchen shelf to the table and finally dealt with the asters. Their petals had gone papery and pale, stems bent where water had evaporated away. I pressed the best 3 between wax paper in my father's field guide, the same one Emmy and I read during the outage. On the margin of the owl page, I wrote the date of the storm and one line, returned with care. I kept the crossed porch stones at the tree-line marker, but I moved the jar itself to the cabinet above the sink where it still sits, empty and clean. Nothing from that week was treated like evidence for a courtroom. It was treated like memory, with weight. In late April, Emmy and I arrived to find new growth, pushing through thawed leaf litter, and the creek running high and bright. Bristle, slower now but stubborn, made it to the porch and lay in the sun with a sigh that sounded like approval. At the porch corner, where winter had washed everything plain, 3 flat stones were crossed again with fresh asters tucked beneath them, purple and open in spring light. Emmy knelt first, touched the petals with one finger, and smiled without surprise. He remembered, she said. I crouched beside her. Yeah, looks like he did. We left a small bunch of wildflowers from the ditch and 1 blue marble, then went inside to open windows and let the house breathe. No figure stepped from the trees that day. None needed to. Years later, I'm telling you this from that same porch with repaired steps, a straighter roofline, and Emmy's old clearing drawing framed by the door. Ranger sits on the guest room shelf now, retired, but still watchful, seam holding. Bristle is buried under the cedar snag with his collar wrapped around a smooth stone. I still work for the co-op, still check weather before bed, still carry practical habits like tools in a belt. But I don't confuse skepticism with wisdom anymore. The world is larger than the part I can diagram, and kindness is not less real because I can't explain its full mechanism. On cold mornings, I still walk to the tree line with an apple or a handful of flowers, set them by the marker, and stand a minute in the hush before birds start up. Most days there is nothing new to see. Once in a while there is a print or a careful bend in brush, or the old feeling of being noticed without being crowded. That has been enough. I kept my promise to Emmy. I stayed. And in staying I found out I was not beyond repair after all.